The Wars of the Roses, Richard III, the princes in the Tower, were they killed by their uncle, or are there other possibilities? What would have happened if Bosworth Field had been reversed? What if Richard had won? And other things we are going to discuss today on episode 17 of Just Feudal Things. This is something of a two-parter in the August Wars of the Roses month. If you didn't check out the previous episode, you'll probably enjoy that as well, as it sort of sets up some ideas of monarchy and how the Wars of the Roses really shaped, changed, and in a large part disintegrated the monarchy of the Middle Ages. The goal of this podcast is to bring you conversations with subject matter experts and enthusiasts that are maybe slightly off the beaten path, some things that none of us have really gotten a chance to explore before, and some insights into some very unique angles of how to look at and explore medieval history. If you'd like to follow along for all of my medieval content, the home for the Memory Medieval Project is on Substack. You'll find the link to that in the description. And if you are feeling generous and have the resources and would like to support the project financially, of which, of course, I'm very grateful, you can choose to do that on Substack as well. And of course, your support helps me to start exploring ways of doing bigger projects and even more frequent projects. If I get enough patrons, I could start doing more frequent episodes. Today's guest is Matt Lewis. He's an author and historian of the medieval period with a particular interest in the Wars of the Roses and Richard III. He's the author of several books, including The Survival of the Princess in the Tower, a biography of Richard III, and a narrative account of the Wars of the Roses. Matt co-hosts History Hits Gone Medieval podcast and is the host of Echoes of History, which explores the history behind the Assassin's Creed games. If you are not familiar with Matt Lewis, as I wasn't when I invited him on the podcast, funnily enough, he has actually produced quite a bit of content, which I watched prior to speaking with him. It made me realize that what would maybe be more interesting, rather than just going over The Princess in the Tower and his expertise on that, which we will do some for about the first half of the conversation, but that it might be interesting to explore a little bit more some things that Matt has not talked about, such as his views on history, a little what if around Bosworth, and some of the other angles into Richard's life, as opposed to just talking about some of the things that he has talked about quite a bit already. So hopefully this is something that is a little bit unique and you get a different look into the Wars of the Roses and Matt's view on things. And of course, all of the links for his projects and his books will be in the description if you would like to learn more. And let's jump right in. All right, so you've done some very interesting research on Richard III, and one of your, I guess your most recent book is about the princes in the Tower, and a lot of the evidence around, let's say, around the princes in the Tower. And so when I run into people online who talk about this, of course, even still, I get the instant response, he killed the princes in the Tower. It's all considered a done deal. So maybe you could just run us over, just a very brief, maybe 5 minutes or so, for anybody who hasn't heard this, hasn't heard any of the evidence, hasn't looked into it at all. And of course, you have a book on it if they want to look into it a lot more, but maybe you could just run us through a brief synopsis of what we should think about.
Oh, that's tough. 5 minutes. I could give you 5 hours. I'll try and do 5 minutes. So essentially, the Princes in the Tower, we're talking about the two sons of King Edward IV, the first Yorkist king of England during the Wars of the Roses. Edward dies in 1483 at the age of 40. His death is unexpected, and he leaves behind a 12-year-old son as his heir, who is proclaimed Edward V on his father's death, and Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, who is 9, so 12 and a 9-year-old. For all sorts of reasons that are far too complicated to go into inside 5 minutes, Edward V is removed from the throne and replaced by his uncle, Edward IV's brother, who becomes Richard III. He had been Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and he becomes King Richard III. The legal reason for this is that Edward IV is declared to have married the boy's mother bigamously, that he had been previously married to somebody else. And so all of the children from that second marriage are considered illegitimate, and illegitimate children can't succeed to the throne. There are arguments to be had about whether that's true, whether that's fabricated by Richard, whether it's a true story or not. But that's the legal mechanism by which it happens. At some point during the late summer or early autumn of 1483, those two boys who have been in the Tower of London, which wasn't the same as putting them in prison. The Tower at this point is more like a royal palace. It is used as a prison, but Edward V had gone there to prepare for his coronation. It's where medieval kings go to prepare for their coronation. They start to be seen less and less inside the Tower of London through the summer, and they're last reported being seen on an unspecified date, annoyingly. So maybe somewhere around September is the last time that they're seen inside the grounds of the Tower. They're not really talked about then for the rest of Richard III's reign, despite lots of people claiming that there's immediate outrage that Richard must have murdered his nephews. Actually, everything goes really quiet. And that might be because Richard didn't murder them, but it also might be because if he did, it's bad policy to accuse the king of murdering small children while he's the king. He can come and get you while he's king. So after Richard's death at the Battle of Bosworth, 2 years later in 1485, we get Henry VII on the throne, the beginning of the Tudor era. And the Tudors have to sort of justify why they have taken the crown from a previous king. And part of the reason they do that is to portray Richard as a bit of a monster. This is where his reputation begins to turn a bit blacker and a bit darker. And part of what gets wrapped up in this is that no one really documents definitively seeing those sons of Edward IV ever again. So they get known as the Princes in the Tower, and this story emerges that they were murdered in 1483, most likely on the orders of their uncle Richard III, to get rid of them as potential rivals or threats to his crown. We do get pretenders, what are called pretenders, and pretender is a very specific word in this period, which means a claimant. So pretending doesn't mean that you are a fraud. That would be an imposter. We call them pretenders. It comes from the French for pretendre, to claim. So they claim the throne of England. And a couple of these threats emerge. One, I would argue, claims to be Edward V. The second, more definitely, claims to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower. They tend to be remembered by history as Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck during the early reign of Henry VII. And then kind of through the 16th century, the story just builds and builds as people retell it. Richard becomes a more and more malevolent figure, and by the time you get to Shakespeare at the end of the century, he is the most evil human being that ever lived, the protagonist of the most evil play that Shakespeare writes. He's the most wicked figure around, and he definitely murdered his nephews by that point. And that's stuck for centuries. And the part of the reason I wanted to write the book is if you actually look at the real evidence, there simply isn't enough to say that those boys were dead in 1483, that Richard had anything to do with their disappearance. And there is, in fact, I would argue, lots and lots of bits and pieces, little snippets that you can put together to create an incomplete jigsaw puzzle of the continuing existence of those two boys beyond 1485, beyond the death of Richard III, which would mean that he couldn't have killed them. That's probably way more than 5 minutes, but...
That was good. And I'm not super familiar, but one of the ones that one of the pieces of evidence that seems very interesting to me is I believe it's Perkin Warbeck, who travels around Europe for several years, and he gets the backing of quite a few other monarchs, and even, is it Margaret of York? And it seems like he's got a pretty compelling case that's pretty wide. Usually when you find somebody who is not the sovereign, who's trying to become the sovereign, usually they're backed by somebody else who's trying to put them on the throne specifically for their own reasons. For example, I forget which one it was, I think Michael VII or whatever, that Robert Guiscard tried to invade Constantinople and put on the throne for his own reasons, to obviously take over the empire himself. But this seems pretty unusual to get sort of a consensus of monarchs.
It is, and it's one of the interesting things about Perkin Warbeck's time claiming to be the younger of the princes in the Tower. So the Lambert Simnel affair in 1487 gets support primarily from Ireland. It gets a little bit of support from Margaret of York, who you mentioned is a sister of Edward IV and Richard III, and she is the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy. So she's reasonably wealthy and powerful in the Low Countries on the continent. So what is now roughly the Netherlands and Belgium, that kind of part of Northern Europe. She sort of backs it, and the Irish get on board with it, but nobody else is really backing the Lambert-Simnel affair, and it sort of collapses. They invade England, they have a battle, but they lose it, and it's very quickly dealt with. Perkin Warbeck emerges in the early 1490s. So he steps off a boat in Cork in Ireland in 1491, and he says, everybody swamped him and said he looks like a Yorkist prince. And he will later go through this process of saying, they wanted me to pretend to be Richard III's son, and then they wanted me to pretend to be the Earl of Warwick. And this is all, I think, to add to the idea that it's a bit of a joke and a bit of a farce, and he's just pretending to be whoever he can get away with. But it will eventually settle on claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the princes in the Tower, so the one that was a 9-year-old boy when their father died. And like Lambert-Simnel, he gets a fair bit of support in Ireland. Ireland is very happy to rebel against England at this point, so there's potentially something cynical that you can see in that. He's invited over to the court of France, and the King of France throws his support behind Perkin Warbeck. And again, it's easy to see a cynical reason behind that. France and England are rarely not at war during this period, so King of France is going to want to cause trouble for the King of England. Absolutely fine. Henry VII kind of launches a very quickly organised last-minute invasion of France I think it's in October, so out of campaigning season. And he only agrees to leave France again when the King of France withdraws his support for Perkin Warbeck and kicks him out of the kingdom. So Henry, to me, this suggests that Henry is quite seriously spooked by the appearance of this boy getting support from France. Is that because he's concerned he's really the younger of the princes in the Tower, or is it because France are clearly trying to destabilise England? Henry had come to the throne with French backing that allowed him to invade and depose and kill Richard III. So if he's thinking, I'm not having that happening again to me, there again is a political reason for doing it that doesn't necessarily mean that he believes the younger of the princes in the Tower is alive. So I'm calling him Perkin Warbeck. He claims to be Richard, Duke of York. He introduces himself around as Richard of England. So I don't like calling him Perkin Warbeck because that's playing into the story that he was a fraud. I'm not entirely sure that he was, but I'm going to call him that simply because that's the name people know for this period. Perkin Warbeck then moves to Margaret's court, Margaret Dowager Duchess of Burgundy's court, and she says that she instantly recognises him as her nephew. And she says he has physical marks that prove he really is her brother's son. And Margaret had met Richard, Duke of York, when he was a young boy. I think she came to England when he was about 6, maybe. So by this point, he's in his late teens. He's going to have changed a significant amount. But they talk about these 3 physical marks that he has: something around his eye, something around his lip, and what later emerges to be a birthmark on his leg. And Margaret will say, not 1 in 10,000 people could recreate these marks that prove to me that this is my nephew. And she has him sit down and write a letter, and she writes a letter to the Queen of Spain, to Isabella, so Catherine of Aragon's mother. And this is, it's again, the cynical political motive here is to garner support from Spain for the war that Burgundy at this point is embroiled in with France. France wants to take over Burgundy. Burgundy is desperately trying to preserve its independence. Spanish help would be absolutely lovely to do that. So you can definitely see a cynical reason why Burgundy is jumping on board with this. He'll go on to gain support from the King of Denmark, who doesn't really add too much to the mix. But one of his most potent and ardent supporters turns out to be the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. And Maximilian will back him 100%, call him Prince Richard, say that he's the rightful King of England, treat him with the highest honours whenever he appears in the Holy Roman Empire. And so you add all of that together. James IV of Scotland as well will get on board with this. And much like the King of France, it's not hard to see why the King of Scotland might want to cause trouble for the King of England. So you can see cynical reasons all over the place. But the point that I try to make with this is, if you've got the King of Scotland, the King of France, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Queen of Spain, the King of Denmark, sort of getting on board with the idea that this boy is the rightful King of England, that he really is the son of Edward IV, and that he should be sitting on the throne of England. That's a dangerous thing for crowned heads of Europe to say. We're in a position and a time here in which there is an absolute belief that God appoints monarchs, that these people are put there, they're chosen there to be there by God. Not anybody can do this job. You have to be born to do it. If all of these people back a boy that they know to be a fraud, or they seriously suspect to be a fraud, we're told later that he's just a boatman's son from Tournai, so absolute peasant stock, from sort of northern France. If they decide to back him and say that he should be the rightful King of England, they are setting a really dangerous precedent. They are tarnishing their own position as monarchs, because they're essentially saying anyone off the street can be plucked up and put into this position. And if they do it to Henry, they might get some short-term political gain out of causing trouble for the King of England, but they really do risk creating a longer-term problem for themselves, in that their enemies will just pluck someone off the streets of Nottingham in England and send him over to France and say, well, clearly this guy's the real King of France. There is danger in denigrating the idea that you have to be chosen by God to be a king of anywhere. So I think the fact that so many crowned heads are willing to get on board with this plot is at least interesting. You can definitely pick that apart, and you can say that there are cynical political reasons why they would all join in. And that's part of the fun of the debate of all of this, that we can't definitively answer what the motivations of all of those people were. There might well have been a big mix of motivations, but the fact that so many crowned heads in Europe are willing to get on board with it, for me, just rings a little alarm bell.
It's very interesting, very compelling, I think. So the Tudors are, I mean, the War of the Roses is obviously a pretty popular thing in modern culture. A lot of people like the Tudors, a lot of people like the period. Do you get accosted by Tudor fans in real life?
In real life, most people, I mean, social media is the worst place for polarizing views on these things, right? If you like Richard III, you must hate Henry VII and his mom, Margaret Beaufort. And if you like Margaret Beaufort and Henry VII, you have to hate Richard III. In real life, most people, I find, are much more reasonable than that. You know, they tend to be interested. I'm interested in all of those people. I call myself a Ricardian. I'm definitely fascinated by Richard III. I believe he's been given a really bad rap by history. But I also think Margaret Beaufort is someone really interesting and admirable that we should all know more about. I think Henry VII does an incredible job as king in really, really difficult circumstances. I definitely don't have an axe to grind against the others. But, I get called a nutty Ricardian. I have been told that my ideas are bizarre and weird. I'm a bit of a nutcase. I don't really care, if I'm perfectly honest. And most people are happy to say that to you on social media and will tend to be much more friendly face to face. It's the nature of social media, isn't it?
Yeah, I get the same thing. I'm somewhat of a Ricardian myself, but for Richard the Lionheart. And so, of course, anytime I post, which I've actually found watching a lot of your videos, there's a lot of similarities between the two Richards, I think. But anytime I post anything positive about Richard the Lionheart, I get Philip Augustus, French nationalists on social media who are like, "You hate French people." And I'm like, 80 or 90% of my comments, my content is just positive French history. I don't know what you're talking about. Richard is French. Like, that's a little strange.
I mean, all the interest in all of these things is the nuance. And history is not about good guys and bad guys. Hollywood has created this image that you have to have a hero and a villain, and that they must meet and battle it out, and hopefully good will overcome evil. Real life is just not like that. Do we really think, take Shakespeare's Richard III, this guy is a self-proclaimed villain. He wanders around the stage saying, I'm going to kill my wife and I'm going to kill some kids, and I get that guy killed and this guy killed. What are you going to do about it? And, as an audience, we watch that play and we laugh along with his jokes. And we found ourselves quite liking this charming guy while he tells us he's going to murder some children. And by the end of the play, you're almost willing him to win the Battle of Bosworth, even though he's the worst person you've ever seen in your life. And I think the genius of what Shakespeare has done with him is for me, this play asks more questions of the audience than it does the people in it. If you're sitting there watching this guy tell you he's going to murder his wife and kill children, and you're laughing at his jokes, and you're not getting up and stopping him, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing it? What are you doing? What does this say about you that you're sitting there watching this and laughing along? But do you really think that Richard III, when he was alive in 1483, do you really think he considered himself the villain of his own story? Do you think he was deliberately doing things that he knew people would believe to be terrible? Nobody is the villain of their own story. Everybody wants to believe that they are the hero of their own lives. Most people are trying to do the best that they possibly can. Most people are trying to live a good life. And sometimes that means making tough decisions. Sometimes those decisions turn out to be wrong. Sometimes they're misinterpreted to make you look like a bad person. But I think anywhere in history, Richard I is a great example. I think he is probably the best example of what medieval people expected a medieval king to be in the things that he sets out to do. Getting captured on the way back from the Crusades is not his fault, and it ends up bankrupting the kingdom and causing a whole load of problems that he can't have foreseen. Same with Henry V, I think. They have these traits that people would want in their medieval king if you were living in those times. And we live in such different times now that those aren't the things that we expect from a ruler, a leader today. So we have changed. It becomes tricky when we start to project that backwards and say Richard I and Henry V were terrible people because they did things that I wouldn't want to see done today, because that's simply not how history works, not how the world works. So I think anytime that you're looking at history and you're seeing a bad guy and a good guy, just have a slightly better look. Sometimes it happens. There are obvious examples of people in history who were just diabolical, but it doesn't happen all that often. So I think wherever you see history in one dimension and you see good versus evil, have a better look, because the interest is really in the nuance and the detail of what's going on.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think one of the reasons there's so many cartoonized versions of medieval monarchy, like you're saying, that there's the good guy and the bad guy, or the King John from Disney, and people have this idea that the king can just go around and say whatever he wants and do whatever he wants, and he can do all these terrible things, and people are just going to be like, well, the king said it. But the systems of governance didn't really work at all like that, and if you had a king like that, he would be removed at some point.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really good example of precisely that kind of idea in the story of Richard III and the Prince in the Tower. So Thomas More at the beginning of the 16th century writes perhaps the first really famous account of Richard III murdering the princes in the Tower, the definitive kind of, he has them smothered with featherbed pillows. And Thomas More writes that Richard sends an order from York, up north in England where he is at the time, to Sir Robert Brackenbury, who is the constable of the Tower, and instructs Robert Brackenbury to have the boys killed. Robert Brackenbury is so utterly disgusted by this order that he refuses to obey it. He sends word back to the king that I'm not going to do this. And then Moore tells us that Richard sends Sir James Tyrrell down and he gets him to borrow the keys to the Tower off Robert Brackenbury, have the deed done, and then give the keys back. And Robert Brackenbury stays on as constable of the Tower of London. And then Robert Brackenbury will die fighting for Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. And there are so many things going on there that I struggle to square that circle, that Richard would give an order to his constable of the Tower. His constable would say, no, I'm choosing not to obey that order. And Richard would go, okay, I'll get someone else to do it, but you can keep your job. It'll be fine. And on the other side, that Robert Brackenbury is so disgusted by an order from his king to murder children that he's willing to disobey it, but will then not only remain in Richard's service, but will die fighting at this man's side at the Battle of Bosworth. Those things just can't make sense to me. And those are the reasons that I think there are holes in all of this story. Thomas More in particular, I don't think Thomas More was writing non-fiction history in the way that we expect it to be written today. History during this period is allegory. You write it to deliver a political message. You think about this from ancient Rome onwards. History is used to deliver a moral or a political message or something instructional to current rulers. It's meant to speak about modern day politics. It's not non-fiction history in the way that you or I might go to a bookshop and buy a book about Richard III today and expect it to be a narrative story that gives us all of the facts. There are layers to what is going on in history during this time. So I don't think Thomas More is writing non-fiction, yet it becomes accepted as non-fiction. It's built upon and it reaches this pinnacle in Shakespeare's play and then becomes the accepted version of Richard III. So all of those things are built on foundations of sand if you look just a little bit closely at the evidence.
And that's a really interesting point about the way that history used to be told and maybe the way that we view history now, because I feel like even now, there still is two real, maybe two different purposes of history. There's sort of the fact finding, here's what happened, we can count the troops, these people were here on these days. But there is also the cultural implication of this is part of your story. These are the people that created the system that you came down from, or those types of things. So there is these sort of two sides to it. And so even today, I feel like there's a lot of moving back and forth between the two. And certainly back then, I think they recognized the importance of the narrative aspect or the cultural aspect or that, the story.
Yeah, I mean, these things are, by their very nature, they're always evolving. They're organic things. History today is not what it was 400 or 500 years ago in terms of the telling of history. And who knows what the telling of history might look like in another 500 years' time. It may well not look like a narrative non-fiction book that I've written a couple of years ago. Things change, and we need to just be aware that we, much in the same way as we might not, or we shouldn't, project the cultural mores of today back into the medieval past. We shouldn't be doing that with the way that people understood history either, because it was different.
And so let's get back into the history just a little bit, because you have another book, I believe, that is biographical about Richard III. And so a question I wanted to ask you about that was that Richard, as a young man, do you think that there was any indications that he aspired to be king?
No. I mean, I do think that Richard III's story has currently changed to the point where that the version of Richard that used to exist, I think you can talk about several versions of Richard III, particularly when you get to 1483. There is the Richard who planned it all along, who desperately wanted to be king and set out to use his brother's death as an opportunity to effect that, and didn't really care about what happened to his nephews or anybody else along the way. You can see a Richard who kind of stumbles through this crisis, because Edward IV's death creates a constitutional and a political crisis. It exposes big rifts in England between factions at Edward IV's court, who almost immediately go for each other's throats. And you can see a Richard who is stumbling through this crisis, desperately trying to do the best that he can. He's making decisions that he feels forced to do until he's almost backed into a corner that leaves him no option but to take the throne. And I think you can see another Richard there who is a bit more of an honest broker, who hears this story of his brother's bigamy, which in legal and moral and religious terms would mean that he couldn't oversee the accession of his nephew. He simply wouldn't feel able to turn a blind eye to that, I don't think, genuinely. So you can see a Richard who is more genuine and who felt like he had no option at the end of it but to be king, even though it was not what he'd ever imagined for himself. And I think the one of those that is really falling away is this idea that Richard had always wanted the throne, that he's from the death of his brother, he's thinking, this is my moment. This is what I've been waiting for. And it's very similar to the myth and the lie that Margaret Beaufort wanted her son Henry Tudor to be king, from the day that he was born, and devoted her life to making him king. It's simply not true. Margaret Beaufort, I think, sees the crisis in 1483. Whenever there is a change of monarch, it's a point of crisis. And people will often see an opportunity in a crisis. And I think what Margaret does is, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent, but, she has been trying to get her son home from exile for 12 years by this point. She has just negotiated an agreement with Edward IV for him to come home and become Earl of Richmond. Edward IV dies before he signs that bit of paper. It seems clear that Richard didn't feel that it was a good time to allow an exiled rebel to come home when all of this crisis was going on. And I think that's the moment when Margaret snaps and she decides to move against Richard. She decides to use this crisis of 1483 as a way to effect regime change that will see her son come home. I think the version of Richard that is madly ambitious for the throne has kind of begun to fall away. You can't justify it with evidence. There was absolutely no signal before the spring of 1483. And I would say you would argue to make a case that it existed before the middle of June 1483, that Richard had any real intention of taking the throne or making himself king or wanting to be king. He had been utterly loyal to his brother Edward IV for more than a decade, ruling the north of England on his brother's behalf. And that's not to say he never disagreed with Edward. We see it when they invade France in 1475. This is meant to be a huge, glorious moment. This was going to be the next Agincourt. With the biggest army in living memory goes over to France with Edward IV. And Edward IV then allows himself to be paid off by the King of France. It's a huge sum of money. All of the people that are with Edward IV, all of his nobles and churchmen that have come with him, get given a pension by the King of France, so an annual payment out of the pocket of the King of France. One of the only people who refuses that is Richard. And it's believed, Philippe de Comines records that Richard didn't go to the treaty negotiations and the signing of the treaty at Picquigny. He was off somewhere else inspecting some troops, because the belief was that Richard was opposed to the peace. He believed that having made all of these preparations, they ought to prosecute the war. They ought to give battle to the French, that Edward was losing face and losing honour by doing what he did. So Richard is not afraid to disagree with his brother, and he's not afraid to do so publicly. He's not afraid to let it be known that he disagrees with what his brother's done. There are a couple of other examples of where he does that as well. But for me, that's very different from thinking I'm going to depose my brother and make myself king. I think you can package this up as a kind of loyal opposition. If he genuinely thinks Edward is making a wrong decision, he would feel like it's his duty as a senior nobleman to make that point, to tell the king that he's wrong. And I think there's a really interesting parallel with their father, Richard, Duke of York. He's another person who I find absolutely fascinating from this period. He has this reputation as having set England on fire, begun the Wars of the Roses out of his own mad, burning ambition to become king, to boot Henry VI off the throne and make himself king. And that simply doesn't stand up to the evidence for me. This is a man who is in opposition politically to Henry VI for more than a decade before he takes the throne. That's not mad burning ambition to take 10 years to do it. And he only does it when Henry has taken away everything that he has. He's declared him a traitor, stripped him of all of his lands and titles. He's kind of left with nowhere else to go, and then he claims the throne. So I think these are both cases where people have seen the conclusion, they've seen the final act, and they've projected backwards what they think this person must have been believing for months, years before then. So this idea that Richard always wanted the throne simply has no basis in fact, and I don't think you can find any evidence to support that notion. The earliest you might be able to pin this on Richard is in the spring of 1483 when his brother dies, and I think it's hard really to make a case for it before about the middle of June when this bigamy story begins to emerge. That might be the point at which Richard has decided either to make himself king, or he has to make himself king, or to as an act of self-preservation, perhaps he has to make himself king by this point. So I don't think that version of Richard exists, and I think that is the one that is beginning to fall away more widely in history as well. I think far fewer people believe that Richard exists now than used to believe it.
That's really interesting about the opportunism, because I think that that's one thing that the modern mind really struggles with, is this concept of how in those times, in times of crisis, as you mentioned, or just in when things are in flux, that there are opportunities to be had. And as an enthusiast of the Italian Normans in particular, who are perhaps some of the most opportunistic adventurers of the time period. That's something that has really struck me, is their opportunism. So, and I think an example of that would be Bohemond on the First Crusade. Of course, he's often cast as the villain, and wow, well, since he was a baby, he wanted to overthrow Constantinople and these other things. But I think if you understand the opportunism of the Italian Normans and sort of their political history and the political history of his father, who went from basically a starving knight, a thief, a brigand running around doing his own thing, to becoming Duke of southern Italy, basically. And then, him going on crusade, he obviously pledges allegiance to Alexios, and then later says, well, actually the oaths are broken. He's an opportunist. He's his father's son. And there was a lot of people in those times that's how you got ahead, was, finding these opportunities, finding these sort of gray areas, or stepping into a crisis as sort of the definitive actor who can stabilize things or take control, or, whatever, make things good, however it is.
Yeah, and I think the Normans in Italy are a really good example of that, because you can see the stepping stones. These are quite often the younger sons, third, fourth, fifth sons of Norman lords, who can't find anything to do at home. Their big brothers have got all the good stuff. So I don't know, let's go to Italy. The weather's nice. Maybe we can find something to do. And they end up, getting a lot of land. Sicily becomes effectively a Norman kingdom in the south of Italy. And then the First Crusade is just the next rung on the ladder, really, because they're about to go to this place. Yes, it has a religious motivation to it. They're going to retake Jerusalem. But actually what they're going to do is take a whole load of land and territory. And someone needs to own that land and territory. And if you can get on that train, hop on, and who knows what it might bring you. So these are, soldiers of fortune, if you like. They are mercenary in character. They are opportunists who are willing to exploit the crisis of the First Crusade, the crisis that the papacy paints in the Holy Land and in Jerusalem. They're willing to use that to get land and power for themselves, as well as doing God's work while they're there.
Yeah, I think I'm really struck by sort of the medieval mind of opportunism, and how it's so different. Today I think things are just very stable, and so we don't. It's hard to be in that mindset.
Yeah, but we're not a million miles away from that, I think. If you think about how some of the wealthiest families in the world got wealthy in business terms, stock market crashes in the 1920s in the US made some families so incredibly rich that they're still rich today. That's an opportunity in a crisis. It's being in the right place at the right time and making the right decision. And what is somebody else's disaster becomes the generational making of your family. So it's still something that perhaps goes on in the world in a slightly different guise, at least recently, if not still today. I mean, look at the .NET bubble. Internet is an opportunity for everybody if you got on early and you made your fortune out of it. So I think some of those things still exist. We look at it slightly differently. We're not necessarily concerned about going and carving out chunks of a kingdom for ourselves, but everybody wants to be the next social media influencer or celebrity on TV or the next movie star or whatever else. It's just about how you get there. And I think some of the people that make it are good at seeing the opportunity that comes with a crisis.
Definitely. One of the things that you mentioned was how Richard served his brother loyally for more than a decade, and he was obviously an experienced soldier and seems like a pretty competent commander. Did he go wrong at the Battle of Bosworth, or did he just get unlucky?
I mean, hindsight will tell us he went wrong. That must be the difficulty of going into a medieval battle, isn't it? This belief that God is going to determine the winner. Well, if you think you're the good guy in your story, you've got to believe that God's on your side. If you don't think God's on your side, you wouldn't go into battle, because he's not going to help you win it. Richard's military career is quite an interesting one, and I would argue is sometimes overstated. Actually, he would have obviously undergone the military education of a medieval nobleman. So from a young age, he's taught to ride and to fight and to hunt, to hone all of those skills. He gets his first taste of battle at Barnet in 1471. That's a Yorkist victory during the readeption. So when Henry VI is put back on the throne briefly, Edward IV is driven out of England. Richard goes with him, comes back, and they fight. At Barnet, they fight their first cousin, the Earl of Warwick, the man who is remembered as the Kingmaker, their kind of famous cousin. And it's fought in the fog on an Easter Sunday. Shouldn't be fighting on Easter Sunday, and fighting in the fog is not great either. But Richard apparently acquits himself well in that battle at the age of 18 in his first battle, so well that when they get to Tewkesbury in May of the same year, he's given command of Edward's vanguard. So he's put in charge of the front portion of Edward's army because he performed so well at Barnet. And Tewkesbury is another victory. So at 18, Richard has been in 2 battles and won 2 of them, albeit he's not the commander. He's not giving the orders. That's his big brother, Edward, but he's learning and he's doing a pretty good job. He then has no kind of military experience. So they have this invasion of France in 1475, where they don't actually fight anyone because Edward allows himself to be bought off. Richard's next real military experience will be to lead an English army into Scotland in 1482. And this was a campaign. So France was beginning to cause trouble on the south coast of England. The peace treaty that Edward had agreed in 1475 is beginning to fall apart. Part of that is trouble with Scotland on the northern border. So quite often France will use Scotland as a proxy to cause trouble in the north of England as a sleight of hand to distract attention. And so Edward decides that he can't go north to deal with Scotland because he needs to keep an eye on what France is doing in the south. And he gets Richard to lead this campaign for him. And this campaign is, I don't know, it's pitched as a success, but King James in Scotland, James IV, is taken captive by his own nobles and locked inside Edinburgh Castle. And they're so busy squabbling amongst themselves that they can't organise themselves to fight the English army that arrives. So Richard is able to march his army. They lay siege to Berwick, which at this time is on the Scottish side of the border. It's a border, strategically important border town that's changed hands several times during the medieval period. They lay siege to Berwick because the Scots are currently in control of it, and they march all the way up to Edinburgh, completely unopposed. They can't find anybody to fight. And they get to Edinburgh, take control of the city, but they can't get inside the castle. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen Edinburgh Castle, but you ain't getting inside there. It's on a big volcanic rock. You would need months and months of a siege to get into Edinburgh Castle. So they can't get to James IV. So they have no one to negotiate with, no one to fight, no one to defeat, really. Richard agrees a peace with the city of Edinburgh, and some terms around the return of a dowry for a marriage to Edward IV's daughter and all of this sort of stuff. Marches back south. They retake Berwick. So the last time that Berwick has ever changed hands, it's been on the English side of the border ever since Richard took it in 1482. And that's the end of the campaign. So it's pitched as a success in that he marched to Edinburgh, but he didn't actually fight anybody. He didn't actually have an enemy trying to stop him. And his only other military campaign is Bosworth. This will be the first time that he is a commander on a battlefield, and he loses. So it's difficult to say that he has this really strong military background. By 1485, he's been in 2 battles 14 years ago. And he's led a military campaign the previous year, but not that involved any fighting. And this is the first time that he is giving the orders. He is laying out the battle plan. So that's new to him as well. I think you can make an argument that his battle plan was reasonably sound. And it's possible that the cavalry charge that he leads across the battlefield was part of what he planned to do on that day. So you see Norfolk leading Richard's vanguard sort of move out to the side a little bit. And Oxford, who is leading the bulk of Henry's army, they've put all of their army into one block because they have so few people. They move out to block Norfolk from flanking them. And this clears a path between Richard and Henry. So Richard could well have been thinking that the way that I end this battle quickly is to kill Henry. If he's gone, nobody has anything else to fight for. So if Norfolk moves out, draws Oxford away, clears that path, I lead this glorious, thunderous charge of the cavalry, like knights of old, back in the good old days, the stories that you used to read about all these chivalrous knights on their horses. We go back to those tactics. And part of the problem that they experienced in England during the Wars of the Roses is that English armies had perfected this tactic in France of beating the French by using predominantly longbows, by using dismounted men-at-arms, and arranging their armies so that they managed to get the better of the French. But the trouble is, when you get back to England, you're fighting people who have exactly the same tactics as you now. So you're cancelling each other out. And quite often these battles are hard fought and very even for a very long time because both sides are doing the same thing. And I think it's possible that at Bosworth, Richard has realised this and is thinking, I need to do something different. So why don't I go back to a charge of the heavy cavalry? Like Edward I used to do, that worked so incredibly well. We'll go back to olden day tactics to break this kind of stalemate, because he needs a quick win. And the reason he needs a quick win is because there's this third army on the field under the Stanleys, and nobody is quite sure what they're going to do. They might fight for Henry, they might fight for Richard. They've promised both of them they will. Probably neither of them trust the Stanleys particularly well. So another reason for Richard to get it over and done with is to deal with Henry before the Stanleys can make a decision to come in on his side and swing the battle in his favour. So there are lots of reasons to think that actually this cavalry charge is a genuine plan from the very beginning and not an unreasonable thing for Richard to have done. It's cutting the head off the snake. If Henry goes down, the battle is over because there is no one else for his men to fight for. The problem for Richard, really, if that was his tactic, is that the bodyguard that has stayed around Henry Tudor at Bosworth is largely made up of French soldiers who know how to defend against a heavy cavalry charge. So they deploy this defensive tactic called the hedgehog, which is exactly what it sounds like. Lots of long spears and things like that pointing out directly at the horses. I mean, if you're ever going to use Braveheart as a historical example, it's that moment when they raise up all of those stakes when the horses are charging at them at the supposed Battle of Stirling Bridge. So if Richard's plan fails and falters, it's because he didn't foresee the French being able to counter the tactics that he was going to use, because actually in trying to break the stalemate of English armies fighting English armies, he's gone to a French tactic which the French know how to defend against. And so he ends up getting killed during that fighting. He goes down with all of the household knights around him, including Sir Robert Brackenbury, that man from the Tower of London who is supposedly he ordered to murder the princes in the Tower. So it's hard to say. Richard's military career, as I said, I think is often overstated. It's not as full as we believe it is. He fights in 2 battles under his brother, and his brother wins them both. He leads a military campaign which involves no fighting. And the first time that he is actually in command of an army, he loses.
So something that I hear a lot is a very famous what if is, what if the Battle of Hastings had been reversed? That's a very common one online. But one that I rarely ever hear is, what if the Battle of Bosworth Field had gone the other way? What if Richard had killed Henry? What do you think would have sort of been the future from there?
I mean, Henry, part of the reason that Richard was so keen to deal with Henry is that he really is the last available person to oppose Richard. I was nearly going to say he's really scraping the bottom of the barrel, but that's probably being mean to Henry Tudor. I don't mean that to be derogatory, but this is the guy who is quite far removed from the claim to the throne, but he's just the last person that people can focus on who wish to oppose Richard. So Richard must have felt, there are reports that when Richard hears that Henry Tudor has landed in Wales, he's at a hunting lodge near Nottingham. And sources talk about him being excited that the day has come to finally deal with this last threat to his crown. If he can kill Henry Tudor, it's plain sailing the rest of the way. Whether it would have been plain sailing, we don't know. We can't foresee what other threats might have arisen. Not least, if Henry VII faces threats from people claiming to be Richard's nephews, the princes in the Tower, it's entirely possible that those threats could have come back to haunt Richard too, if people emerged who claimed to be the princes in the Tower. But Richard must have felt like if he'd won, it was plain sailing. I think the what if Richard had been king for longer is a really interesting question. The dissolution of the monasteries and the destruction that comes with Henry VIII's break with Rome, if that doesn't happen, England is a very, very different place. Even if England becomes Protestant rather than staying Catholic, the dissolution of the monasteries and the English Reformation is a very particularly English Henry VIII thing, and it is incredibly destructive. they tear these monasteries down, they destroy the libraries. How many more books would we have from medieval England if that hadn't happened? When Richard's wife passes away in early 1485, he begins negotiations. So there is this lingering story, which was contemporary, it was around at the time, that Richard planned to marry his own niece, Elizabeth of York, who will eventually go on to marry Henry VII. That's not true. I'm willing to go on record and say that's a lie. Because what Richard does when his wife passes away is begin negotiations to look for a wife amongst the Spanish or Portuguese royal families. Part of the reason that he's doing that is that the Spanish and Portuguese royal families by this point have a great deal of Lancastrian blood. They're all descended from John of Gaunt, whose daughters married into the Spanish and Portuguese lines. So he's trying to play exactly the same game that Henry Tudor will play of uniting the white rose and the red, bring the house of York and Lancaster together. He seems to settle on marriage to a princess named Joanna of Portugal. And as part of that arrangement, Elizabeth of York is also going to be married to a man named Manuel, the Duke of Beja, who eventually becomes King Manuel I of Portugal. And I think people use this idea that Richard is arranging a marriage for himself and for his niece, and his enemies sort of twist that into Richard's planning to marry his niece, because it's mud that you can throw at a king and it sticks, and it's stuck ever since. If Richard marries into the Portuguese royal family at this point, what are the Portuguese up to? Well, they're exploring the New World. They're heading west very soon after the Battle of Bosworth. 10 years later, Columbus is off, and the Portuguese are right in that race too. So England could have been involved in that age of exploration in the West far earlier than they were. Instead, they become consumed by religious conflict on the continent and the papal threats and Spanish threats to Elizabeth and all of that kind of thing. But they could have been following where Spain and Portugal were leading out west. So everything could have looked an awful lot different. Richard is also, one of the most interesting things about Richard III that I would love people to take away from this and look up a little bit more is the one parliament that he holds in 1484. So during his reign, he only has time for one parliament. Some of the laws that this parliament passes, I think we would consider today to be quite socially progressive. He shows a genuine concern for ordinary people, by which I mean, non-nobles, non-gentry, the people further down the social ladder. People have tried to say that that's cynical, but there is no reason for a struggling, desperate king to favour those people at the bottom of the social ladder. They can't keep you on the throne. They can offer you nothing. So I don't think that you can make an argument that it's cynical. And it's also an interest that you can see clearly during Richard's time in the north as Duke of Gloucester for 10 years previously, that this is a genuine concern of his. And so if you end up with a king who is, I don't know, maybe more socially progressive, do you have less resistance to royal authority? And then do you avoid the English Civil War of the 17th century because, Charles I decides he wants to be an absolutist monarch in the style of the French kings, and Parliament by this point is so powerful that it won't accept that? Well, Richard shows himself to be a monarch who is willing to work with Parliament, to work for the people. And there are so many ways in which Richard's Parliament is a really good way to demonstrate that for all people want to call Richard a tyrant, he was almost the exact opposite of a tyrant. And I would argue that perhaps some of that socially progressive idealism is part of the reason that people turn against Richard, because if you give power to people further down, you have to take it from people further up in order to give it to them. Who's not going to like that? Well, the people further up. Who has the power to do something about it? The people you're upsetting right now. So the people who abandon Richard and go off to Henry Tudor's court in exile are Yorkists who tended to be close to Edward IV, and they are almost exclusively southern shire gentry folk. They're not nobles, but they're not peasants either. They're the people who are losing power in Richard's England because he's trying to share it out in a way that he thinks is fairer, and they don't want to lose what they already have. And so the reason they want rid of Richard is because they want their power and their money and their corruption back. Richard comes to power on an anti-corruption ticket, complaining about Edward IV's reign and how corrupt his own brother had become during his time as king. I think the interesting thing is it's difficult for people to go onto the field at the Battle of Bosworth and say, I'm marching under a banner that says, I want my corruption back. I want to be allowed to beat the little people up and steal all their money, please. It's much nicer or much easier to justify what you're doing if you go into that battle and later say, pretty sure that guy killed his nephews. You know, I'm defending small children here. Isn't he a terrible, terrible monster? And those are the ways I think in which Richard's reputation as this usurping, tyrannical child killer was able to take hold, because it suited the people that came afterwards to have him portrayed that way. But you look a little bit closer at what he does, and I simply don't think you can call him a tyrant.
You're obviously an expert and very passionate about this. How did you get into Richard III?
I guess I always have to blame my history teacher for A level. So in the UK, that's the exams we do at sort of 17, 18 at the end of senior school. I did history for A level, and I had the most fantastic teacher. She just taught history in the most engaging and inspiring kind of way. Her name was Sarah Merrick. So if you're ever listening, it's your fault, miss, that I caused people all of this consternation by saying that Richard III was a good guy. And we did the Wars of the Roses as part of that. And I would challenge anyone who studies the Wars of the Roses not to find it absolutely fascinating. There is so much going on. You know, I did my A levels, I say it quietly, over 30 years ago. And it's fascinated me ever since. And I'm still learning the Wars of the Roses. You know, I haven't got to the bottom of all of the local feuds and the ins and outs and the ways in which people are related and connected to everybody else. You know, I'm that crazy guy in the meme with the murder board behind him with the strings connecting everything, panicking because it all doesn't make sense anymore. I've always just found it endlessly fascinating. And I remember when we got to Richard III in the Wars of the Roses, I swear I almost remember this exact lesson when the teacher sort of stopped and said, now, from this point onwards, when we're dealing with Richard III, you just need to give a little bit more thought than you have been to who is telling you the stories about Richard III. Who's writing this? When are they writing it? Why are they writing it? What do they want you to believe? And how does that stack up to the evidence that we have? And I remember sitting at that lesson and thinking, well, that's interesting. And it just stuck, because I do think it's one of those things that if you dig a little bit into the story of Richard III, whether you end up believing him to be a better man than you thought he was or a worse man than you thought he was, there is so much more to it than you think you know. There are layers and layers, and you can dig and dig. And I've been digging for 30 years now, and I still haven't found the bottom of that trench. I still find it endlessly fascinating. I still learn new things all of the time about Richard III and the Wars of the Roses. It's kind of the endless passion of my life. I don't think I will ever be able to sit here and say, Michael, I understand the Wars of the Roses, because I don't think I ever will completely. But I just find it endlessly fascinating. And I think it's something about human nature. It's that idea again that history has said to us, here is a terrible villain. You should hate him. And then you look a little bit around the story and you think, I'm not sure this guy's as bad as he's been made out to be. And you dig a little bit more and you find some of the things that he did, and you think this can't be the monster that history has given us. And the more you dig and the more you uncover, I think the more it challenges. And I would say that's probably true if you start off thinking Richard's a good guy. You can find some things that he did that would make you think, oh, maybe he's not all that good actually, because he's just a human being living a life in really, really difficult times, really complicated times where it's hard to make the right decision. And history is going to judge your every mistake. And once you die on a battlefield and you lose the throne, your reputation is there to be torn to shreds by the wolves in all of the years that will follow. And I suspect that's what's happened to Richard III. And I think he deserves us to have another look at him, another think about the man that he was.
What evidence, obviously, aside from maybe an obvious one of like, you know, Richard in his own handwriting saying, of course I didn't kill the kids, you know, of course, obviously something obvious, but what evidence do you think that we would need to sort of tip the scale, or or what do you think, for us to generally have, let's say the default, more nuanced view of Richard? What is there more evidence, do you think, or do you think it's just time, or what do you think needs to come together for that?
I think it is something that, research is always ongoing into the period of the Wars of the Roses and Richard III. The Richard III Society does a huge amount of work, and it has a research arm that is packed with academics who are digging in archives. You look at something like the Missing Princes project run by Philippa Langley. This is democratizing archival research. It's sending ordinary people into archives to go and trawl through records that quite often haven't been looked at for 500 years. That is incredible. That's amazing. And who knows what will be found tomorrow? There could be a piece of paper found tomorrow in an archive that renders everything I've just tried to say to you, tried to convince you of, utterly incorrect. And I'll have to phone you up and say, Michael, is there any chance you could not put out me saying that Richard III was a good guy? Because it turns out he really wasn't. So we need to be aware that, as I've said about history and stuff before, this is always organic. This is always a moving feast that you're trying to dine on when you're learning these things. I think the story of Richard III, and particularly the princes in the Tower and what people think happened to them, has become so polarized that it's hard to imagine a single piece of evidence that will emerge that will make people universally accept the truth of it. Either that he murdered his nephews or that his nephews survived beyond the end of his reign and therefore he can't have murdered them. I can't imagine. I think even if you found Richard III's diary and there was a page in it when he wrote, "Today I had my nephews killed. They're definitely dead. I saw the dead bodies. I ordered them to be buried. They're gone. They're not coming back." There are people who would believe that diary was fake and that it didn't really happen. And so I think because positions are so entrenched, and this is the real shame of it, I think, that it's become so polarized and people are so entrenched that they're not willing to engage with the argument. Sometimes there are lots of people in the middle who are, but if you find yourself unwilling to engage with arguments that oppose your position, if you find yourself unwilling to move your position slightly, I always talk about my biggest frenemy in the history world is Nathan Amin. He's Henry VII's biographer. He is madly in love with Henry VII. He's an absolutely bizarre human being. I'm joking. He's lovely. But he holds opposing views to me on almost everything throughout this period of history. He's a fan of the Beauforts during the Wars of the Roses, where I'm with the Yorks. He favours Henry VII, where I'm on Richard III. He thinks Richard killed the princes in the Tower. I don't think he did. He supports Swansea Football Club. I support Wolves. There's nothing we agree on. But we constantly engage with each other and talk to each other, and we're able to respectfully disagree with each other. And that seems like something that is so missing from the world today. I don't have to agree with everything that you say and everything that you believe, but I can still be your friend. We can still talk about it. I don't have to entrench my position even further and just shout at you from where I am, because nobody is going to move. And I find that talking to Nathan has changed my position. I still think the things that I think about the princes in the Tower and Richard III. But Nathan, every conversation that I have with Nathan is food for thought. And if you refuse to think about it and slightly moderate your position and reassess what you actually think and believe, I kind of think you've lost the art of history, because it should be constantly evolving. You should be constantly rethinking, reassessing. And Richard III is a great example of that. The Richard III Society exists and has existed for over 100 years now, in the belief that Richard deserves a reassessment. Not that he deserves to be held up as a saint and exonerated of everything he's ever accused of, but that this deserves more thought and more nuance. But I think, as I say, it's just a shame that I think some of those positions are so entrenched and so polarized that it's hard to imagine a single piece of evidence. Maybe if you got DNA from the remains of Perkin Warbeck and it proved he was the younger of the princes in the Tower, that becomes pretty definitive then that he survived beyond Richard III's reign. But Perkin Warbeck's remains were buried in a church in London that was bombed during the Blitz, and nobody knows where that grave is exactly anymore and whether it's still intact. So whether we could ever get to that point, I don't know. People talk about the bones in the urn in Westminster Abbey, and they should be DNA tested. They could be. People claim that those bones belong to the princes in the tower, but examining those bones will never answer all of our questions. So if they're examined and they turn out to be the princes in the tower, it would make it highly likely that Richard III ordered their murder, but it won't prove it. There are other suspects around, like the Duke of Buckingham in particular, and several other high-ranking nobles might have had access to it. And I'm going to annoy the entire listening internet by saying Margaret Beaufort could have done it, because nobody wants to believe Margaret Beaufort did it. I don't believe she did it because I don't believe anyone did it. So it doesn't prove what really happened to them. And if those bones turn out not to be the princes in the tower, that doesn't mean that Richard III didn't murder them in 1483. It just means he didn't bury them within the confines of the tower where they'd been staying. There are other stories that he had their bones rowed out into the Thames and thrown overboard into a deep trench partway out into the sea. So either way, some of those things just can't answer all of our questions. Maybe Perkin Warbeck's remains are one of the very few things that could prove, but again, if they turn out to be the bones of Richard, Duke of York, it proves one thing. If they don't turn out to be the bones of Richard, Duke of York, it doesn't prove that he died in 1483 and that Richard III killed him. It just means his fate is unknown and Perkin Warbeck wasn't him. So it's really, really complicated and it's hard. And I think it's going to be this longer term accumulation of evidence that is going to end up tipping the scales rather than one revelatory piece of paper that will one day change everybody's mind.
And so lastly, and I certainly sympathize with this as an enjoyer of Richard I. I feel like he deserves a reassessment, which lately I've been going through Gillingham's biography of him, really incredible book. And so you mentioned the Richard III Historical Society. The goal of that is to reassess Richard III. And I think just playing devil's advocate for both Richards, even, I think a common counterpoint to that might be something like, well, these are kings who are somewhat historically irrelevant. What's the value? So this is the question: is what's the value of sort of reassessing these guys who, I guess you could say, are historically irrelevant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's an interesting one. Richard III is a really odd one in that this is a guy who was king for just over 2 years. Out of the whole 1,000-year medieval period, even if you're just interested in medieval history, but over the more than 1,000 years of the existence of the Kingdom of England, he's been king of it for 2 years and a couple of months. How is he the one who's ended up with a worldwide society dedicated to studying him and interested in him? It is a real oddity, and I guess there are two elements to it. I think there is the history, and it's the belief that history is important, that knowing the truth is important. So much of what became England and Britain is affected by the arrival of the Tudors. I said, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, they make seismic changes to England for good or for ill. I would argue a lot of them are for ill. That wouldn't have happened if Richard III hadn't been killed at Bosworth and his reputation subsequently tarnished and trampled so that the Tudors could kind of stand on top of it and appear to be the good guys because they vanquished this terrible, terrible person. You could say, why does it really matter what date the American Declaration of Independence was signed? What difference does it make to know that date? Whether it was the 4th of July or the 10th of November, who cares? But people do care because it matters. It matters to know those things. There is also the human element to it, I think, in that for a lot of people, there is a concern for the underdog, someone who has had their reputation trashed and isn't there to defend themselves. Just a belief in kind of fair play. It's the reason we have things like jury trials, and you watch 12 Angry Men or something like that, where you've got the one guy who is adamant that we need to think a bit more closely about this, and eventually he will convince everybody else. Why does he do that? Everyone else is keen to just call him guilty and we can go home. There is an element of that with Richard. So someone who isn't there to defend their own reputation, I guess we would like to think that our reputations wouldn't be treated that way. And it's this idea that for people, for human beings throughout history, our reputation really matters to us. Don't know why. It has no monetary value for most people. It's not something that you can cling on to. It's not really something that you can leave to your children. In your will, I leave my eldest son my reputation. It doesn't really mean too much, and yet we cling to these things. People are concerned about their reputations, and it's almost like a physical commodity at that point. And there is a sense that Richard is robbed of his, or that it has been mistreated, that it's been kicked around the schoolyard, and someone needs to go and save it. His reputation is maybe the little kid in the playground that's getting picked on, and most people would feel compelled to go and save that little boy and stop him being beaten up by the bigger kids. I think it appeals to all of those kind of very human elements in all of us, if that makes sense. It's such a weird thing to grasp, isn't it? Such a hard thing to put a label on, because it isn't a physical thing. It's something in people, I think, this desire to see justice done, whatever that justice is. If he's guilty, for most people in the Richard III Society, they will tell you if he's guilty, he's guilty. The point is we want to be sure. We want to find out. We want to prove it beyond a kind of a reasonable doubt. And it's that, I guess, the desire to do that for someone who died 500 years ago is a really hard thing to explain. And yet it does appeal to so many people. And it appeals to you about Richard I. It appeals to lots of people, about all kinds of people through history. Strikingly, it appeals to very, very few people about King John, maybe. I do know one person who is determined to start a King John Appreciation Society, but he is alone in that, I think. But for the most part, we're kind of keen to restore those things, or at least fully understand them. And Ricardianism, I mean, I quite often make the point that Shakespeare's play Richard III, I think, is an absolute work of genius if you watch it as a play. The travesty is that it's been accepted as a piece of history, which it isn't. And Ricardianism is only a reaction to Shakespeare's play. If Shakespeare hadn't written that play, I don't think anybody would be talking about Richard III today. Ricardianism is a human reaction to that portrayal of the worst in all of us. And perhaps a desire not to believe that there are really people out there who are like that, who will revel in murdering children and killing their wives to gain power and authority. We don't want to think that those people are real. And so Ricardianism is, to some extent, it begins in the early 1600s, within years of the death of Elizabeth I. Once the Tudors are gone, Sir George Buck will begin the process of creating what becomes known as Ricardianism, taking a look again at Richard III and saying, hang on, all of this stuff that we've been told, there is no evidence to support all of that. So I think I'm rambling a little bit now because I'm trying to put a handle on it myself. I think it just appeals to something very human in people.
All right. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a total pleasure. Really fascinating stuff. Of course, we'll have the links to all of your books and social media in the description for anybody who would like to check those out. I would encourage you to do so. And I'll leave you with the last word here. If there's anything else you'd like to say about Richard III, the Historical Society, the evidence, anything that you'd like people to leave on.
I think, just like all of history, approach the story of Richard III with an open mind. If you go into it with a closed mind and your decision already made, that's not history. Just set all of your baggage aside and sit down and think about it with fresh eyes and an open mind. And you just might be surprised by what you find out.